Okay, we're looking at Baptists and the founding of the United States. The Baptists and the founding of the United States. We're going to talk about the colonial period and the frontier and actually the American War for Independence and so forth. Now I'm going to give you a number of Roman numerals, and I usually give you about one sentence to put down, but there are often stories and illustrations that go with it. To what degree you try and put that down, you're on your own. But let's start out. Roman numeral 1 is the Pilgrims. And what I want you to put down is that there were a number of Baptists among the Pilgrims. There were a number of Baptists among the Pilgrims. Let me explain that statement just a little bit. Depending on what book you'll read, you'll sometimes read that the Pilgrims were Congregationalists. But you can also find books that will tell you that the Pilgrims were Baptists. And depending upon who you want to quote, you can even find quotes in those books to go with that statement. Let me say to you, the Pilgrims as a group were a group of people that believed in an independent church. And you know what we've seen over and over again in our study? When you have people that believe in an independent church and they believe in studying the Bible for themselves, some of them will take it far enough to get a handle on all of what we call the Baptist distinctives, and some of them won't. It is too much to say that all the Pilgrims were Baptists. But there were certainly some people among the Pilgrims who held to all of what we call the Baptist distinctives. As a matter of fact, as a group, the Pilgrims held to the independent church and the regenerated church membership and separation of church and state and independent church and so forth. But you can't say they were all believers in believers' baptism. You can't say they were all believers in baptism by immersion. But, and sometimes folks today who are so used to what we have today find it strange, why were some real Baptists gathered into a church with some people who didn't believe everything that they did? But you got to remember, this was not the day and age in which we live in which there's half a dozen independent Baptist churches in every town. Okay, the Church of England was dominant. People just who believed in anything besides the Church of England sometimes gravitated together because there wasn't enough of them to be anything else. Okay? So you can quote Pilgrims who believed in sprinkling babies. But you can't say all the Pilgrims believed in that, because you can quote Pilgrims who believed in believers' baptism. Okay? So it's not fair to say that all the Pilgrims as such were Baptists. But there were Baptists among them. For example, one of the very first group of Pilgrims that came over on the Mayflower is a fellow named Francis Cook. After the colony got established, he started a second church, which was a Baptist church. So then you had the official Pilgrim church and you had a Baptist church, after there were enough people to support more than one church. If you study the list of the pastors of the Pilgrim church, the second pastor and the sixth pastor would only baptize adults. And that created some debate, because some of the folks wanted their babies baptized. But there were other Pilgrim pastors who would baptize babies. But there were Baptists certainly among the Pilgrims. Okay? Roman numeral 2. Rhode Island. That's the Baptist colony. And by that I mean it was started by Baptists. And matter of fact, you'll find all through the history of Rhode Island as a colony. Rhode Island is referred to as being independent, and the people are stubborn and contrary, and they won't work with everybody, and they're thought of as completely different than all the other colonies, which only goes to tell me that Baptists back in those days were a lot like Baptists are today, you know. And I don't mean that as an insult. A lot of the folks who write about it were being critical of them. I mean, they were just independent people. And then what had happened, you know, the Pilgrims start the Massachusetts Bay Colony, but soon it becomes heavily inhabited by Puritans. And they believed in having a state church. And so the Baptists, who didn't have any trouble with the Pilgrims, do have trouble with the Puritans. And so sort of the foundation of Rhode Island, you have Baptists that come to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and they run into trouble with the state church, and they're uncomfortable there, so they end up moving out of the state, out of that region, wanting someplace to settle. And there are really two people that are important in this. A is Roger Williams. And there is a debate over what the First Baptist Church in the United States is, the one started by Roger Williams, the one started by John Clark. And this is, well, let me tell you about Roger Williams, maybe you understand a little bit of the background of the debate. Roger Williams was an independent preacher who'd come to Massachusetts Bay Colony. He taught several things the Puritans didn't like. He believed in the separation of church and state. He believed in baptism by immersion of believers only. He also extensively believed in a ministry to the Indians. And he believed that all the land that they occupied had to be purchased from the Indians. And he believed in having Indians and settlers in the same church. Now, there was an argument in that day. If an Indian gets saved, they're supposed to be in a separate church. They're supposed to be in the same church with them. By the way, he was very widely accepted by the Indians. But all of this caused him to get banished from Massachusetts Bay. So he went to the area that would later be called Rhode Island. And there were some Baptists already there. People who'd moved out and were living on their own. They didn't have a church. He had never been baptized by immersion, even though he was preaching baptism by immersion. One of the Baptists baptized him, and he started a church. Well, the argument comes up, since there was no church there, and that person baptized him as an individual, rather than a church baptizing him, was he really baptized? Okay? And let me again say that this was a confusing day and age. There's no reason for us to have an argument like that today. Anybody wants to get scripturally baptized, we can get them church, you know. But there was some argument over whether he was properly baptized. He started a church. It was called a Baptist church. However, he left it after about 3 months and started calling himself an independent again. He continues to be very important to Rhode Island, though. Some people will say then that his church was the first Baptist church in the colonies, and other folks say, nah, that doesn't really count as a Baptist church. Is John Clark. He starts a colony in this same general area. And he is a Baptist pastor. He had been a Baptist pastor in England. He starts a colony, and the folks that came with him to start this colony are mostly Baptists, and so they start a Baptist church. And John Clark becomes a pastor. That church, by the way, is still in existence. It's still an independent Baptist church. Now, I personally kind of think they deserve the title of the First Baptist Church in the colony. But they start a church there, and it begins to function and flourish, and out from it they send other people to start churches. And he and Roger Williams together go to England to get this to be recognized as a colony by the English government. And there's something unique in their charter. All these various colonies are started with a charter that's granted by the king. Their charter grants everybody religious freedom. There's no establishment of church whatsoever. And that reflects the Baptist ideas of Roger Williams and John Clark. And consequently, lots of Baptists choose to go to this colony. So not only is it started by 2 men that you would call Baptist preachers, you would certainly have to call John Clark a Baptist preacher. Most of the original settlers in Rhode Island are Baptists who are coming there because the political charter reflects the doctrinal statement of the Baptists. Folks who say that doctrine and the Bible and all that have no place in public life, you understand the First Amendment is just a restatement of the Baptist principle of separation of church and state. It's a doctrinal statement. And that's what these folks have. A lot of interesting things happen to them, and we don't have time to do the subject justice, but one of the things that happens, one of the members of John Clark's church, an older couple, moves, and I don't think they realize they did it, but they move into the area across the Rhode Island line, and they're actually living in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Well, John Clark and 2 of his church members go to visit this elderly couple. And Baptists are outlawed by now in Massachusetts Bay. So when they go there to visit this church member, they're arrested. And they're told they have to pay a fine or they'll be horsewhipped in public. Well, Pastor Clark and the one man pay the fine. The other man refuses to pay the fine on the grounds that he will not recognize the state's authority to fine him for being a Baptist. So he's taken and publicly horsewhipped. That was no light thing. I mean, that would leave you scarred for life. At his whipping, a fellow named Henry Dunster, who's the president of Harvard University, is present. And he is just so stirred by this. Why would this fella go through a public whipping rather than acknowledge the authority of the state to regulate the church? So he begins to study the Baptists and try and find, why would you do this? And at the end of his discussion, he comes to the conclusion that the Baptist distinctives are biblical. And he identifies with the Baptists. And he writes a book about baptism. And he gets fired as president of Harvard University for being a Baptist. Because you have to understand, Harvard University was in a colony where it was illegal to be a Baptist. But he came out publicly, became a Baptist, and got fired from Harvard. Okay? This same fella, whose name was Obadiah Holmes, he's the one that went through the public whipping rather than pay the fine. He eventually becomes a Baptist pastor in Rhode Island as well. And he does a lot of writing and exercises a lot of leadership and influence that causes other Baptists to stand up for what's right. Okay? As you might guess, the first Baptist college was started in Rhode Island. And it became a training center for Baptists around the colonies. You don't need to try and write any of this next down, but I'd like to read it to you. This is from John Clark's tombstone. And in those days it was common, today it's common to carve maybe one sentence on a tombstone. In those days it was common to carve a considerable epitaph. This is the epitaph from his tombstone. To the memory of Dr. John Clark, one of the original purchasers and proprietors of this island and one of the founders of the First Baptist Church in Newport, its first pastor and munificent benefactor. He was a native of Bedfordshire, England, and a practitioner of physics, and he was a doctor in London. He with his associates came to this island from Massachusetts in March 1638, and on the 24th of the same month he obtained a deed thereof from the Indians. They did that. He and Williams both went and made deals with all the Indian chiefs that claimed any of this area and paid for it and got title deed to it so that there was no dispute. He shortly after gathered the church and became its pastor. In 1651, he with Roger Williams was sent to England by the people of Rhode Island colony to negotiate the business of the colony with the British ministry. Mr. Clark was instrumental in obtaining the charter of 1663 from Charles II, which secured to the people of the state free and full enjoyment of judgment and conscience in matters of religion. He remained in England to watch over the interests of the colony until 1664, and then returned to Newport and resumed the pastoral care of his church. Mr. Clark and Mr. Williams, the two fathers of the colony, strenuously and fearlessly maintained that none but Jesus Christ had authority over the affairs of the conscience. He died April 30th in 1676 in the 66th year of his age, and is here interred. Okay? It is interesting as you find people writing about them. They say, oh man, this is going to create a time when people are going to argue about religion and they're going to debate and all that kind of thing because there's no state church. And by the way, there was some truth to that. But I'll tell you what, if you study Rhode Island, you find less conflict. I mean, many times these debates break out in violence and people get killed. In the other colonies, you find less violence, and you have one historian at a time writing, notwithstanding so many differences, here are fewer quarrels about religion than elsewhere. The people live peaceably with their neighbors of whatever profession. Okay? Now, these folks not only do they do a tremendous thing in standing for the truth, I do believe the example of religious freedom in Rhode Island as it flourishes as a colony is the major factor in religious freedom coming to characterize the whole nation before you get very much farther down the road. Roman numeral 3, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Yes. Henry Dunster. Henry Dunster. They made fun of him after he became a publicly a Baptist, called him Dunster the Dunker. Hey, a fella could have a worse title, I can tell you what. I don't think that title hurt him in heaven any. Roman numeral 3 is the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He said, Despite the fact that Baptists were outlawed in Massachusetts Bay, they kept going there. Despite the fact they were outlawed, they kept going there. People kept starting Baptist churches. There's a non-stop record of persecution of Baptists. All the way through the history of Massachusetts Bay Colony. People are getting arrested, people are getting fined, people are getting exiled from the colony. About the best thing you can say for the Puritans is they never executed any of these folks, but there is constant persecution. And we could tell a lot of stories that have to do with this. Just give you one example. A fellow named David Yale, who became the founder of Yale University, when he was a child, his mother and father were both put in prison for being Baptists in Massachusetts Bay Colony. And he did not identify with the Baptists when he grew up, which is unfortunate. But that's just the kind of example of thing that happened. He had to be raised for a while by his aunt and uncle because his mom and dad were in prison for being Baptists. If you talk about Massachusetts Bay and the Puritans, probably the event that gets remembered the best is the Salem witchcraft trials. And people today make fun of the Puritans and all that. And let me say, when the Salem witchcraft trials started, they were dealing with some real witches. That would sound funny to most of the world, but I'm going to tell you, you read the Bible, you know that witchcraft, demonology, and all that is real. And when it started, they were dealing with some real witches. But it is a fact that the thing went crazy. And they began to start accusing people wildly of witchcraft. And after the first round of trials, you undoubtedly get some people tried and convicted of witchcraft who had nothing to do with witchcraft. And then it gets to the place where these young girls who were 12 and 13 and 14, some of you can remember what it was like to be 12 and 13 and 14. If you were brought in, they would have them in the courtroom, they started making the accusations about witchcraft, which in the beginning I think were pretty accurate. Their first accusations were really against people who were trying to introduce witchcraft to them. But if you came into the courtroom and they laughed and giggled and pointed at you, that was considered evidence of finding you guilty of witchcraft. And these girls learned that they were the center of attention. And it just goes wild and gets out of hand. Well, that is, in fact, not only is that used to attack the Puritans, constantly that is used to attack Bible believers. And if you talk about standing for Christ today, so what do you want? Witchcraft trials everywhere and everybody being sent to be burned at the stake in the prison and all that. I can't tell you how many times that has been mentioned to me when I have been on radio or television in any kind of a thing where you're handling phone calls. And, Salem witchcraft trials, is that what you want? Trial of public step, and everybody brought up and accused of witchcraft and all that. Well, let me tell you, you cannot label the Baptists with that. While it was going on, a Baptist pastor wrote a book about how wrong it was. Now, I want you to put this down. His name was Robert Califf, C-A-L-I-F, Robert Califf, and he was pastoring an illegal Baptist church in Boston at the time he wrote the book. The theme of the book is that it's wrong to convict people without evidence. Novel idea, huh? It's wrong to convict people without evidence. Anybody want to guess what the reaction to his book was? Yeah. If you're protecting the witches, you must be one. And it became routine for Puritans to call Baptists protectors of the devil and protectors of witchcraft and the defenders of witchcraft because they publicly disapproved of what was going on in the trials. By the way, there is a principle there. The truth has got to be more important to us than public perception. The fact is, as terrible as witchcraft is, it's wrong to convict somebody of being a witch when there's no evidence. Okay? And the issue was not whether or not you were for witchcraft. The issue was what was the evidence. But I like to point out when I'm challenged about that, my forefathers were fighting the thing while it was happening. They weren't sitting safely 300 years down the road in history talking about how bad it was. At the time, they were standing up and saying how bad it was. Okay? So if you want to blame some folks about that, look for another crowd. Don't look for the Baptists to blame about that. One other thing I want to mention about that period, one of the most prominent Puritans is a fellow named Cotton Mather. Matter of fact, the whole Mather family. And they had names that would surprise us today, like Cotton and Increase and all that as first names. There were several generations of Mathers that were important in the Puritan leadership. Towards the end of Cotton Mather's life, he broke with the idea that the Baptists should be persecuted, and he started speaking up for them. And he sort of shocked everybody by going and preaching the ordination sermon for a Baptist preacher. Unfortunately, you didn't find a lot of the Puritans that went along with that. Baptists are being persecuted in Massachusetts clear up into the War for Independence. Roman numeral 4. Let's mention some other colonies. Pennsylvania was founded by William Penn, who was a Quaker, for the purpose of religious freedom. So it became a popular place for Baptists to go. William Penn, by the way, his parents had been Baptists. He abandoned one of the Baptist distinctives when he began to teach that there was an inner light that you could still get revelation from. In other words, he didn't believe the Bible was the sole authority. He'd accept it as the final authority, but not the sole authority. And I had people say, well, what did William Penn, who is a good man and a good preacher, and he stands for a lot of truth, but he kept believing that God was giving him revelation. He said, what was happening to him? I can tell you what was happening to him. There's a little voice inside him telling him that all his ideas were from God. But you know what that voice was? That was him telling him he was right. Okay? I mean, we're very capable of that. Y'all ought to know that. You ever want to do something real bad, and you prayed and said, oh, God, is it your will for me to do this? And you'd already really knew you wanted to do it. I watch guys and girls age, and many of you do that a lot. You know, get really attracted to somebody and they say, Lord, is it your will that I be with this person, the most wonderful, beautiful, attractive, marvelous, pleasant person on the face of the earth? Is it your will that I be with them? You know what the answer comes back every time? It's just an amazing thing. That's what William Penn was doing. Or some guy decides he wants to take a church, or he wants to do this or that or the other, and the church he's pastoring, everybody's mad at him, and somebody offered him a church with pay $200 a week more, and at least to start out, nobody's mad at him, and he prays and says, God, what is your will for me to stay here where I'm miserable, or go there where I'd be happy? And you hear this voice, and it says, go, my son. You know? That's you talking to yourself. But by the way, those thought processes aren't necessarily wrong. They're just wrong when you call it the voice of God. But in spite of that, I mean, people criticize Penn for this, and he deserves criticism, but I don't know that he was all that far from the rest of us when he was doing some of that. But he was an interesting man. He was a pacifist. His parents had loaned a lot of money to the King Charles, and King Charles couldn't repay it. He offered to forgive the loan if Charles would let him start this colony where there could be religious freedom. And a lot of interesting things about Penn. William Penn had grown up around Charles. William Penn, however, because of his belief in separation of church and state, believed it was wrong for you to bow to any man, and believed because of that it was wrong for you to... There's a whole different cultural thing, but you were expected to take your hat off, a man was, in the presence of the king or in the presence of the archbishop, when you were not asked to take your hat off for anybody else. But the Quakers believed it was wrong to take your hat off for anybody, but since you didn't normally come in the presence of the king or the archbishop, it wasn't necessarily a big deal. Penn goes to see the king, and folks are wondering what he's going to do. Is he going to take his hat off? If not, is Charles going to, arrest him or for whatever, for being disrespectful to the king? And because you were required by law to take your hat off in the presence of the king. And so folks were waiting to see what was going to happen, and they had been childhood friends and so forth. And William Penn comes into the presence of Charles with his Bible under his arm and his hat on, and gets to walk all the way up to the throne, and he doesn't take his hat off, and folks are waiting tensely, wondering what's going to happen. Charles stands up, takes his hat off, and says, the law says only one person can have a hat on in the presence of the king, so I just figured today it'll be you. He gives, and he gets a good deal out of it. He gives a bunch of land he's never seen, never done anything with, has some remote claim to, in exchange for this debt. Penn starts a colony, and the record of this is tremendous. You can't find one story of religious persecution in the Pennsylvania colony. What's more than that, there's never a fight with the Indians. William Penn goes over there, meets the Indian tribes. offers to buy the land from every Indian tribe that has any claim to it at all, and the word gets around and Indian tribes start coming from all over the place who've probably never been there before, claiming part of the land. But he buys it from them. He buys their claim. And for considerable period of time, whenever the Indians wanted to negotiate a treaty, they insisted on going to Pennsylvania because it's the only place they felt safe. He's a tremendous man, in spite of some of the mistakes that he made as a Quaker. He was a good man. In fact, it was common for a lot of the Quakers to still practice believers' baptism and be called Quaker Baptists. Now, we don't have time to go through all of the colonies, except to say Baptist churches get started in all of the colonies. They face persecution in many places. Delaware, I believe, is the only other place that they never undergo any persecution, but Delaware was also owned by William Penn. But the persecution varies. There's a lot of it, for example, in Virginia, not that much in the Carolinas, because most of the Baptists that went to the Carolinas went out on the frontier and nobody knew they were there anyway. Roman numeral 5, the Philadelphia Association. I want you to put down a term here. The term is voluntary association. This has become a very popular thing among American Baptists. That is where Baptist churches agree to form an organization to work together. But the organization has no legal control over the church. And you find this extremely popular idea among Baptists, independent Baptists in the United States. We have a number of voluntary associations today. What I mean by a voluntary association, they don't own you or control you. Anytime you want out, you say, I quit. That's the theory of a voluntary association. That doesn't always happen in practice, because they become, well, maybe they're not legal controls, they become psychological and financial controls. Just for example, technically the Southern Baptist Association, Southern Baptist Convention is a voluntary association. But it doesn't work that way too much in practice, because most church buildings are built with loans from the Southern Baptist Convention. And so what happens, usually in the loan, there's a requirement you stay in the Southern Baptist Convention until the loan is paid off. And usually the loan's granted at like 2 or 3% interest. And if you were going to go to a bank and try and trade that loan over, it costs a lot of money. Now, technically, can you do that? You can. So it's still voluntary. But you get this financial hold. In other groups, I think there's a psychological hold. And people get so used to being part of whatever that if you ever didn't want to go along with it, you'd have a real problem getting out of it. So I will tell you, I am not a big fan of voluntary associations. I don't preach against them. I don't criticize people for belonging to them. There are a number around that are very fundamental in their doctrine, but I think there's a danger of losing your independence as a church without losing it. I mean, you haven't officially lost it, you haven't legally lost it, but in reality, you lose it. Now, I don't criticize my brothers and sisters over all that, but I just want to tell you, I think this idea of a voluntary association you should be very careful with. But what happened, particularly in these days, there's so many things that Baptists need that they don't have, that they begin to feel this pressure to work together. And Philadelphia Association is a group that people belong to from all over the colonies, and they work together to accomplish things. Roman numeral 6 is the Warren Association, called that because it came out of Warren, Rhode Island. This is a little different type of association because it had one purpose: to fight for the independence and freedom of the church. In my mind, this is a really tremendous story. It's founded by a fellow named Isaac Backus. He pastored the First Baptist Church in Warren, Rhode Island. He pastored it for 60 years. And for most of this time, the church shared him with this cause. He traveled all around the colonies fighting for religious freedom, raising money in support for churches that were being persecuted, standing with preachers that had been arrested. And he formed an association for that purpose, for Bible-believing Baptists to help one another when they were under pressure from the state. Frankly, I'm not but a little convinced there might be a need for another Warren Association today. But one of the things that I'm impressed with, that local church got a vision of that, and they shared their pastor with that cause for a long period of time. Yes, sir? Backus. Isaac Backus. B-A-C-K-U-S. Brother Carl.
One purpose?
One purpose was to fight for the freedom and independence of the churches. So he fought against state licensing preachers and against churches paying taxes and against the state limiting what kind of literature the churches could publish. By the way, he wins a lot of battles during this period of time. This is another person that I think is extremely important in terms of the religious freedom and liberty that eventually becomes part of the United States. I think he does more than any one man to change the concept of a state church. From number 7, the Great Awakening. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this. The Great Awakening is a revival that sweeps across England and the colonies, and it changes a lot of things. And one of the things that happens is that there's a great deal of emphasis on personal salvation. And almost all the Baptist groups split over whether the Great Awakening is a good thing or a bad thing. In fact, it was very common to call folks who did not like this public evangelism the old lights, and to call the people that responded to it the new lights. And so it's hard for us to understand some of the issues that they argued about then, but there's some we can understand. For example, Great Awakening, the preaching of George Whitefield and so forth. George Whitefield would come to town and preach to the whole town. And the Baptists would get in on it, and the Methodists would get in on it, the Presbyterians would get in on it. Well, some people didn't like that. And when I say he came and preached to the whole town, you understand things aren't like they are today. You're talking small towns. We're not talking about the kind of building today. Whitefield could preach, and a whole village hear him. Didn't matter whether they went to the services or not. You know? And he would come, and they'd build a brush arbor right outside of town, and he'd preach, and everybody would hear. I mean, nobody today can imagine that, the throat that God gave him and the circumstances and all that. But when he came, if he'd come to Haines City to preach, there wouldn't be any issue about whether or not folks were coming to the service. You didn't have to leave your house. You're going to hear him preach. And it's an amazing thing. And the life of Whitefield is an amazing thing. Whitefield was not a Baptist and not an immersionist, but he was friendly to the Baptists. He joked about how often his little chickens became ducks. What he meant was that the converts in his ministries ended up going under the water because they get baptized in a Baptist church somewhere. And when other folks preached against the Baptists, he wouldn't. He started an orphanage in Georgia and hired a Baptist preacher to run it. There were a lot of issues that got involved in this. And what happened was the people that responded well to Whitefield and similar things tended to spend time together. And they ended up forming new churches. They ended up calling New Lights and so forth. During this period of time, this affects the General Baptists, the Regular Baptists, and in particular Baptists all. They practically all three split over this and become different groups. One of the most important is a group called the Separate Baptists. And I want you to make a note of them. The Separate Baptists were in favor of the Great Awakening. Most of them were Arminian, but they were sort of split off the other Baptist groups. They were led by a fellow named Samuel Stearns, and he does, in my opinion, one of the wisest things strategy-wise. There's a big fuss. I think it was in Connecticut, but there's a big fuss. A bunch of them have ended up forming their own church. And he says, look, in North Carolina, there is a town where all three of the main roads out to the frontier meet. He said, here we're controversial, we're a lot of trouble, the whole town is arguing over us. He said, let's move there and start a church right on the edge of the frontier where everyone going to Kentucky and everyone going to Western Carolina and everyone going to Tennessee comes through. And we'll have a ministry to all those people traveling through. So what happened? He leads a group of people. They move there. By the way, can you imagine making an appeal to folks like that today? Saying, man, this town would be a good place for Baptist church. Let's move there. But he moves with all these families to this area, and they have an incredible impact, an incredible ministry to people coming through. And there is a reason why, when you study the American frontier during this period, that almost everybody turns out to be a Baptist or a Methodist. And Samuel Stearns and the separate Baptists were a big factor in why so many become Baptists on the way. And again, this is another subject we're not even beginning to do justice to in their experience, but they had a vision for reaching people while they were moving to the frontier. And as a result, they reached a lot of folks. Now, I will tell you, I have not met a separate Baptist today that I could fellowship with. The ones I've met take the position that if you believe in eternal security, you know you're the devil, and if you believe in Bible colleges, you're the devil. Well, it's pretty hard for me to get past that test, you know. But people sometimes respond, and they talk about what a reclusive group the separate Baptists are today, with the assumption that they've always been that way, and that wasn't the case. In fact, almost the opposite. They were the New Lights. They were the ones that responded to Whitefield. They were the ones that got involved in the citywide meetings with the Methodists and the Presbyterians. Okay, in the beginning. Well, they grew and they became significant. Roman numeral 8, Virginia. And Virginia had a very strong state church, the Church of England. And there's persecution of Baptists all along here in Virginia. And it really got strong in the 1750s and 1760s, that 20-year period before the War for Independence. The preachers were told they couldn't preach without a license. Well, would Baptists take a license to preach? No. So they were in defiance of the law from the beginning. And they were fined, and they were imprisoned. And it got even worse because it was a law that your children be baptized as an infant, and they would come into homes and take your children away and baptize them and then return them to you. And that was aggravating enough that as people began to complain to that, they started taking the children and not returning them, but putting them in Church of England homes. And it gets very intense. This sort of reaches a pinnacle in 1768 when 3 Baptists get arrested for preaching, and they get put in a jail. And I'm going to go ahead and have you write this down because this is how the incident is remembered. It's the Culpeper County Jail. 3 Baptists, 1768, 3 Baptists get arrested for preaching in Virginia. And they get put in the Culpeper County Jail. And they start preaching through the windows in the jail. I mean, this is a curious thing. Crowds start coming to hear it. It makes everybody uncomfortable. They get let out because they're uncomfortable with the developing of the crowds, but they go on preaching, so they put them back in jail. And so they have a trial for them. This is what attracted such significance. Patrick Henry, probably the most well-known and influential man in Virginia, himself a Presbyterian, not a Baptist. He was a Christian, I believe, but he didn't believe in baptism by immersion of believers only. He didn't believe the Bible was the sole authority. Patrick Henry volunteers to come and defend these people in court. He sort of shows up slightly after the trial has started. Some people think he did that on purpose, but he gets to make a dramatic entrance. Patrick Henry's there. And it is worth reading sometime an account of his speech. He goes in front of the judge. Of course, everybody, he's probably the most famous man in Virginia. Everybody, what is Patrick Henry going to say? And he walks before the judge and asks what these men are accused of today. And he said, I see. He said, preaching the gospel of Christ. And he goes on to talk about all the heinous crimes for which we build jails and for which we prosecute people and which we go through all these things and talks about how terrible crime is and how important it is to have a government that restrains crime. And then he says, but what are these men here for today? Preaching the gospel of Christ. And he takes his handful of papers and he waves them around his head and says, oh, glorious gospel. And goes on a while, and then he goes on again to talk about how important the gospel of Christ is to the community and what a difference it makes and how important it is that people know Christ and how, and it goes through the whole spiel with all his polished oratory, and then he looks at the judge again today and says, but what are these men accused of here today? Preaching the gospel of Christ. And he takes his papers again and starts to wave them around. Oh, glorious gospel. Crazy. By the time he's done with the defense, the judge just calls the trial over and lets them go. Okay? And there were men, and this is one of the great things about this, there were men who were not Baptists themselves, but who fought for the liberty of the Baptists. And when you understand that, it will give you an understanding of what some of an understanding of what this country was founded on. Patrick Henry was a Presbyterian, but he fought for the liberty of the Baptists. Thomas Jefferson was not a believer, but he fought for the liberty of the Baptists. James Madison was not a Baptist. I believe he was a saved man and a good man, but he wasn't a Baptist. He didn't understand as much as I believe we understand. But he fought for the liberty of the Baptists. You see, men were just fighting for liberty. Didn't matter who it applies to. And I believe that this fighting for the liberty of Baptists is a part of the whole discussion about liberty in general. And it affects what's going on. The same Patrick Henry that goes in front of the judge and says, what are these men accused of here today? Preaching the gospel of Christ is the same Patrick Henry that talks about what the Bible teaches about limited government. And is the one who gets up and says, I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. It's the same Patrick Henry that gets up and brings the legislature into a collapse of chaos and fear, because he gets up and he starts talking about Caesar had his Brutus. Well, you remember what Brutus did to Caesar? He's talking about King George III. Brutus, when Caesar does away with the Roman law, his best friend Brutus puts a knife in his back because he's become a tyrant. So Caesar had his Brutus, and then he goes on to say that Charles had his Cromwell. Well, what did Cromwell do to Charles? Cut his head off for doing away with the liberty of the English people. And then he goes on to say, and King George III. And I mean, the place comes down. People are yelling at him to stop. They think he's going to call for the death of King George III. I mean, they start screaming. People are trying to shout him down. And even his friends and allies are saying, stop, stop. And when the noise finally subsides, and he says, and King George III may profit from their example. I mean, this is saying, what was the issue? The issue is liberty. And if the issue is liberty, the issue is liberty, period. And even if some folks like the Baptists seem weird to everybody, the issue is still liberty. They tell you what, when I was in Greenwood, Indiana, a bunch of us properly went together and fought for the liberty of the Unification Church. I don't have an ounce of sympathy for some young men. But if liberty, they passed a law in Greenwood, it would let the Baptist churches go door to door and the Pentecostal churches go door to door, but the Moonies couldn't go door to door. And we fought that. Because soon as the state can decide who can go door to door, don't you think for 1 minute they're going to leave it just that the Moonies can't go? Okay? I mean, it was a matter of liberty. You don't want to talk to somebody at your door, the answer to that is say, I don't want to talk to you, and close the door. Okay? That's freedom. That's liberty too. And then they can leave. But the issue is liberty. And let me say this. I do believe our Baptist ideas and our Baptist forefathers played such an important role in bringing liberty to our country, but they didn't do it alone. There were other people that stood for liberty, and that's important. I want to get at least one more today in the 5 minutes I've got left. Roman numeral 9, the Boones, as in Daniel Boone and those folks. This is a favorite story of mine for a lot of reasons. My parents were from Kentucky, and one of my earliest memories, my dad had, as far as I remember, 3 books that he read to me over and over again. William Tecumseh Sherman in the Civil War, and Teddy Roosevelt in the Battle of San Juan Hill, and then a biography of Daniel Boone. And my dad died when I was 10, so what memories I have of him are precious. And probably my strongest memory is a big old red chair, and me as a little kid sitting in my dad's lap, and he'd read those books to me. I know he read them all several times. Probably I bugged him to read them all those times. I don't know, probably we didn't want to read them that much. But that got me started on a lifelong fascination with the Boones, and have spent a lot of time studying the Boone family. And some of what I have found has just been absolutely fascinating to me. The whole set of Boones were Baptists. Okay? They'd been Quakers, and they left the Quaker church. To be real honest, one of Daniel's sisters got pregnant out of wedlock, and they threw her out of the church, and so the rest of the family left with her. That may not have been the best reason for leaving, but that's what happened. They left the Quakers, joined Baptists. Daniel Boone's brother, Squire, was a Baptist preacher. He started the First Baptist Church of Kentucky and then later started the First Baptist Church in Indiana. And a number of members of the Boone family were Baptist preachers. But let me tell you this one story. Remind me, because it won't be in my notes, remind me Thursday, because I want to tell you some more about the Boones. But let me tell you at least this story. The story is fairly famous. Most folks don't know what's behind it. The siege of Boonesboro. Boonesboro's got about 30 men in it. The rest of them haven't been captured by the Indians. It's being besieged by 400 Indians and about 60 British. And they've been enduring this siege for days. But the Indians are digging a tunnel under the fort, and they're about to the fort. One day, they're sending all these fire arrows at the wall and at the roofs. And that more fire arrows have hit the fort than they just can't put out all the fires. There's not enough of them. If they go to put out the fires, the Indians come over the wall. If they stay on the wall and keep the Indians from coming over the wall, the fire spreads. It's gotten so desperate they've gone to their little powder magazine. They've put all the women and children in the powder magazine because when the Indians come over the wall, they're going to blow it up to kill them, to keep them from being tortured. You can imagine it's a very difficult moment. Handful of men are on the wall. The women are holding their children to them, trying to calm their tears. Squire Boone's been shot in both legs, so he's in the powder magazine laying in a bed, leading these people in prayer. He's praying out loud, asking the God of heaven to do something for him. What most folks don't realize is he was their pastor. They were all part of the church. That was a Baptist church gathered in that powder magazine. And there, the men on the wall, in their frustration, believing their last moment had come, and out of nowhere comes thunderclouds and a storm, not just a rain, a storm. Storm so bad it washes away so much of the ground, the Indians' tunnel collapses right before it gets to the fort, and it puts the fire out. And the next morning, they look out, and the Indians aren't there. They send out scouts. They're gone. Years later, they're told by the Indians, they saw that storm come out of nowhere. And they said that God was on those folks' side. And they left. That was the Baptist church. Y'all dismissed.